Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried in the classified military archives of our nation's most decorated Native American soldiers? What if I told you that hidden within dusty folders and forgotten boxes at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., researchers recently uncovered evidence of warfare tactics so innovative they've been deliberately kept from public knowledge for over 7 decades? Before you continue watching this video, take a moment to comment where you're from and hit that subscribe button. We need your support to continue bringing these hidden stories to light. Stories that powerful interests have worked tirelessly to keep buried. The year was 1942. As America plunged headlong into the Pacific Theater following the attack on Pearl Harbor, military strategists faced a desperate challenge: how to communicate critical battlefield information without Japanese intelligence intercepting and decoding these messages. The answer came from an unexpected source: the Navajo Nation. While the famed Navajo code talkers have received some recognition for their contributions to the war effort, the story of one particular soldier, Private First Class Thomas Begay from Window Rock, Arizona, remained classified until just 3 months ago when historian Dr. Eleanor Whitehorse made a stunning discovery while researching Native American contributions to World War II. What we found wasn't just another file on code talking, Dr. Whitehorse explained during a recent symposium at Georgetown University. This was something else entirely. Tactical field journals documenting an unauthorized but incredibly effective combat strategy developed by a single Navajo soldier operating behind enemy lines in the Marshall Islands campaign. The journals, written partly in English and partly in a personal cipher that took military cryptographers weeks to decode, revealed that Private Begay had developed a system that modern analysts have dubbed enemy resource appropriation and tactical redistribution, a fancy term for what was essentially a revolutionary approach to ammunition conservation and psychological warfare. Thomas Begay grew up hunting in the high desert of northern Arizona, where ammunition was precious and scarce. His father, a World War I veteran who served with the American Expeditionary Forces in France, taught him that a warrior must know not only his own weapons, but those of his adversaries. This philosophy would become the foundation of Begay's unconventional warfare tactics in the Pacific. Recruited into the Marine Corps in early 1942, Begay's initial role was purely as a code talker. However, mission reports indicate that during the brutal fighting on Kwajalein Atoll in February 1944, Begay's unit became separated from their supply lines after a Japanese counteroffensive. What happened next would never have come to light if not for the recently declassified documents. "We were pinned down with less than 30 rounds per man," wrote Lieutenant James Forrester, Begay's commanding officer, in a field report dated February 7, 1944. "Private Begay approached me with what I initially dismissed as madness, a plan to collect and repurpose Japanese ammunition for our own weapons. When I informed him that their 7.7mm rounds were incompatible with our Springfield rifles, he simply smiled and said, 'That's not what I mean, sir.' What followed was an operation so audacious that senior officers initially refused to include it in official battle records. Under cover of darkness, Begay led a small team of 4 men on what he called a hunting party. Their objective wasn't to engage the enemy directly, but to locate and raid Japanese ammunition dumps. Rather than simply stealing ammunition, however, Begay implemented a strategy that combined his traditional hunting knowledge with psychological warfare. According to Sergeant Michael Dawson's personal diary, also recovered in the archive, Begay showed us how to carefully open Japanese ammunition crates, remove the powder from roughly 20% of the cartridges, then reseal them so perfectly you'd never know they'd been tampered with. He explained that his grandfather had once used a similar technique against cattle rustlers, removing the powder from some of their bullets. When a man's weapon fails at a critical moment, Begay told us, The fear that strikes his heart is more paralyzing than any bullet. The team conducted 7 such operations over a 2-week period, systematically sabotaging thousands of Japanese rounds. The effects were devastating to enemy morale. Japanese field communications, later captured and translated, revealed growing panic among their forces as weapons mysteriously malfunctioned during critical firefights. One Japanese officer wrote to his superior, "The men speak of cursed ammunition. Some refuse to fire their weapons at all, believing American shamans have hexed our supplies." What Begay understood, explains military historian Colonel Frank Harrison, was that in the dense jungle warfare of the Pacific, the psychological edge was often more important than raw firepower. By creating uncertainty about the reliability of their own weapons, he effectively reduced the Japanese combat effectiveness by an estimated 30% in that sector. But Begay's innovation didn't stop there. The second phase of his strategy proved even more ingenious and controversial. "We began collecting their duds, the rounds that failed to fire because of our tampering," wrote Corporal Anthony DeLuca in a letter home that was intercepted by military censors and only recently released. Begay showed us how to carefully extract the firing pins from Japanese rifles we captured. He had modified his entrenching tool to serve as a kind of portable gunsmithing station. He could process a captured rifle in under 2 minutes, removing key components. These components became the foundation for what Begay called field expedient deterrence, booby traps that utilized the enemy's own ammunition against them. He developed a technique for creating pressure-sensitive detonators using the firing pins and springs from Japanese rifles, which could then be attached to their own duds and unexploded ordnance. It wasn't just about killing the enemy, noted Lieutenant Forrester in his personal journal. Begay explained that the purpose was to make them hesitate, to make them second-guess every step. He told me, "When a man fears the ground beneath his feet, he cannot focus on the enemy before him." Marine Corps intelligence officers who later analyzed the effectiveness of Begay's tactics estimated that his innovations may have saved hundreds of American lives while significantly degrading Japanese combat capabilities in the Marshall Islands campaign. Yet, despite this success, higher command was reluctant to formally acknowledge or adopt his methods. There were concerns about the Geneva Convention implications, explains military law expert Judge Advocate General Colonel Martha Richardson. While there was nothing explicitly prohibited about Begay's tactics, they operated in a gray area that made leadership uncomfortable. There were also cultural sensitivities. Some officers expressed discomfort with tactics they viewed as uncivilized or not befitting conventional warfare, which reveals more about their prejudices than about the legitimacy of Begay's innovations. This prejudice may explain why Begay's contributions remained classified long after other World War II tactical innovations were made public. His file contains numerous commendations from field commanders, all of which were ultimately denied or downgraded by senior leadership. In one particularly revealing document, Major General Holland Smith wrote, "While Private Begay's initiative has undoubtedly produced tactical advantages, I cannot in good conscience recommend these methods for wider adoption. They rely too heavily on individual initiative and indigenous knowledge, rather than established military doctrine." The patronizing tone of the assessment speaks volumes about why Begay's innovations were suppressed. After the successful completion of the Marshall Islands campaign, Begay was reassigned away from frontline duty and placed back with the code talkers, a move that many now interpret as an attempt to limit his influence and prevent the spread of his unconventional tactics. "I am being transferred tomorrow," Begay wrote in his final journal entry from the Marshall Islands. "Lieutenant Forrester says it's because my skills as a code talker are needed elsewhere, but I see the way the senior officers look at me now, with a mixture of fear and something else. Perhaps respect, perhaps not. They do not understand that what I've done comes from the oldest knowledge my people possess. the understanding that a warrior must be adaptable, that survival sometimes requires using the enemy's strength against him. This is not new knowledge. It is ancient wisdom applied to modern warfare. As researchers continue to explore the recently declassified files, new details emerge about just how extensive Begay's impact on the Pacific Campaign may have been. There is evidence that despite official disapproval, his techniques spread through informal channels, with Marines teaching each other his methods in the field. We all carried what we called Begay kits, recalled former Marine Sergeant William Cooper in an oral history recorded in 1995, but only recently connected to this case. Small pouches with the tools needed to modify captured ammunition and weapons. Nobody officially taught us this. It was knowledge passed from Marine to Marine, always with the same name attached, Begay. Most of us never met him, but his ideas saved countless lives. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Thomas Begay story is not what he did during the war, but what happened afterward. Unlike many of the Navajo code talkers who were eventually recognized for their contributions, Begay's name was systematically removed from official histories. His discharge papers make no mention of his tactical innovations, and his military records were sanitized to reflect only his service as a code talker. After returning to the Navajo Nation in 1945, Begay rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. According to his niece, Sarah Begay Wilson, who was interviewed by Dr. Whitehorse, Uncle Thomas would only say that he had done what was necessary. He carried the war with him, though. At night, he would sometimes wake up screaming about traps in the darkness and bullets that whispered secrets. Thomas Begay passed away in 1983, never knowing that his innovative battlefield techniques would eventually be studied by military strategists, or that modern special operations doctrine would incorporate principles remarkably similar to those he pioneered. The saddest part of this story, says Dr. Whitehorse, is that we're only now beginning to understand the full scope of indigenous contributions to American military success. These weren't just code talkers. They were tactical innovators who brought traditional knowledge into modern warfare in ways that saved countless American lives. As the sun set over the Pacific Islands where Begay once fought, the shadows he created in the minds of his enemies lived on. Japanese veterans of the Marshall Islands campaign reported persistent rumors of Navajo medicine men who could turn a soldier's own weapon against him, creating what one Japanese memoir described as guns that betrayed their masters. The psychological impact of Begay's tactics extended far beyond their immediate tactical value. Japanese forces began to display increasing paranoia about their equipment, with some units insisting on testing every 10th round of ammunition before entering combat, a practice that significantly reduced their combat readiness and effectiveness. What makes Begay's strategy so remarkable, explains Dr. Richard Blackhawk of the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, is that it perfectly exemplifies indigenous military thinking. Rather than meeting force with equal force, the conventional Western approach to warfare, he created uncertainty and used the enemy's psychology against them. This reflects traditional Navajo military philosophy, which emphasizes winning conflicts through intelligence rather than brute strength. But there's another, darker side to the story that continues to unfold as more documents are declassified. Evidence suggests that after the war, elements of Begay's approach were adopted by government agencies for operations that had nothing to do with conventional warfare. A heavily redacted memo from 1954, discovered in a separate file related to Cold War counterinsurgency tactics, references methodologies derived from the Navajo Initiative being adapted for domestic containment operations. The exact nature of these operations remains unclear, but historians specializing in the era suggest they may have been related to efforts to suppress civil rights and Native American activism. There's a bitter irony here, notes Professor James Runningbear of the University of New Mexico. Tactics developed by a Native American to defend his country were potentially turned against indigenous peoples fighting for their basic rights. It's a pattern we've seen repeatedly in American history. The co-opting of Native innovations without respect for their origins or cultural context. As researchers continue to piece together the full story of Thomas Bigay and his revolutionary approach to warfare, one question looms large. How many other indigenous contributions to American military success remain hidden in classified archives? How many Native American heroes have been denied recognition because their methods didn't conform to Western military traditions? In a small cemetery on the Navajo Nation, Thomas Bigay's grave bears a simple headstone, identifying him as a code talker. There is no mention of his tactical innovations, no recognition of how he turned the weapons of war against those who wielded them. His story might have remained forever buried in classified files, if not for the persistence of researchers like Dr. Whitehorse. The Bigay file represents just one folder among thousands, she explains. Each contains the story of indigenous wisdom applied to modern problems, stories that have been systematically excluded from our understanding of American military history. What else might we find if we look at these archives through a different lens? As researchers continue to uncover more details about Thomas Bigay's revolutionary warfare tactics, the story takes an even more remarkable turn. Recently declassified documents from the National Security Archives reveal that what began as one Navajo soldier's improvisation during the Marshall Islands campaign evolved into something far more extensive, a covert program that military historians now believe significantly altered the course of several key Pacific battles. Dr. Eleanor Whitehorse's continued investigation has uncovered a cache of personal effects belonging to Lieutenant James Forrester, Bigay's commanding officer, which were donated to the Smithsonian by his granddaughter last year. Among these items was a small leather-bound journal with an unusual lock mechanism that had kept its contents hidden for decades. The journal contained detailed sketches, notes, and observations about what Forrester called the Bigay Protocols. What's remarkable about these documents, explains Dr. Whitehorse, is that they reveal how Bigay's approach evolved from simple ammunition sabotage to a comprehensive system of asymmetric warfare that incorporated traditional Navajo hunting, tracking, and spiritual practices adapted for modern combat. According to Forrester's journal, by April 1944, a small, unofficial unit had formed around Bigay, a group of 12 Marines, including 3 other Navajos, 2 Apaches, a Lakota, and several non-native soldiers who had demonstrated exceptional adaptability in battlefield conditions. This group, never formally recognized in military records, operated under various cover designations, but referred to themselves as the Shadow Wolves, a name that would later be adopted by Native American trackers working for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection decades later. They sent us where conventional tactics had failed, wrote Forrester. Beachheads that couldn't be taken, Japanese strongholds that had repelled multiple assaults, supply lines that kept mysteriously reappearing despite our best efforts to cut them. Bigay would study the situation, often spending hours simply observing the terrain and enemy movements, then develop approaches that seemed counterintuitive until you saw them in action. One such operation, previously unknown to historians, took place on the island of Peleliu in September 1944. The Battle of Peleliu is remembered as one of the bloodiest in the Pacific theater, with American forces suffering over 8,000 casualties while attempting to secure the island. What hasn't been recorded in conventional histories is the role that Bigay's unit played in breaking a critical stalemate that had developed around the Umurbrogel mountain complex, a network of some 500 caves and defensive positions that Japanese forces had transformed into a virtually impregnable fortress. Sergeant David Running Horse, one of the Native American members of Bigay's informal unit, provided a detailed account in a series of letters to his brother, that were recently discovered in a family collection in Oklahoma. These letters, never mailed due to security concerns, offer a rare glimpse into the unit's operations. Traditional Marine tactics had failed completely, Running Horse wrote. Frontal assaults led to massive casualties. Flamethrowers and explosives were only marginally effective against the cave networks. The commanding officers were at a loss, contemplating a prolonged siege that would cost thousands more lives. That's when they reluctantly turned to us, or, more specifically, to Thomas. According to Running Horse's account, Bigay spent 3 days observing the Japanese defensive positions, often crawling to within 50 yards of enemy lines under cover of darkness. What he discovered was that the Japanese had developed a sophisticated system for moving supplies and reinforcements through the cave network, primarily during the twilight hours when visibility was poor. Thomas came back on the third night with a plan that made the officers uncomfortable. Running Horse continued. He explained that direct confrontation was futile. The mountain is their ally, he told us. We must make it their enemy. Bigay's approach was radically different from conventional military thinking. Rather than attacking the Japanese positions directly, he proposed a strategy based on what he called making the caves inhospitable. This began with a detailed mapping of the ventilation systems that kept the cave network habitable. Many of these were small, natural openings that would be nearly impossible to detect without the tracking skills that Bigay and other native members of the unit had developed hunting in various terrains. We identified 87 ventilation points over the course of 5 nights, Running Horse wrote. Each was carefully marked on Thomas's hand-drawn map. Not a single shot was fired during this phase. We moved like shadows, using natural cover and traditional movement techniques that Thomas had taught us. The Japanese sentries never knew we were there. Once the mapping was complete, Bigay implemented the second phase of his strategy, psychological warfare, coupled with environmental manipulation. The unit began introducing what Running Horse described as horror smoke into the ventilation systems, a combination of materials that produced dense, acrid smoke with disorienting effects. The smoke was created using a mixture of native plants that Bigay had identified on the island, combined with salvaged chemical components from Japanese and American supplies. The smoke itself wasn't lethal, clarified military historian Dr. Jason Clearwater. Based on the descriptions, it was likely a combination of irritants similar to what we now call CS gas, combined with natural hallucinogens from certain plant species. The goal wasn't to kill the Japanese defenders, but to make the caves uninhabitable and create extreme psychological distress. Simultaneously, Bigay's unit implemented an auditory component to their psychological operations. Using a technique that Navajo hunters had traditionally employed to drive deer, strategically placed sound makers activated by the wind, they created what seemed to be ghostly voices and unnatural sounds that echoed through the cave systems. We placed hollow bamboo tubes at specific angles near ventilation openings. Running Horse explained. When the wind blew across them, they created moaning sounds that carried throughout the caves. Thomas added dried seed pods and other natural noisemakers that would activate with the slightest air movement. To the Japanese soldiers, already disoriented from the smoke and lack of sleep, it must have seemed like the mountain itself was haunted. The effect on the Japanese defenders was profound. Intercepted communications revealed growing panic among the troops, with reports of mountain demons and angry spirits tormenting them day and night. Some Japanese soldiers began firing wildly at shadows, wasting precious ammunition. Others refused to remain in the deeper cave sections, compromising their defensive positioning. On the 5th night of the operation, Bigay introduced the final element of his strategy. Using the firing pins and other components harvested from captured Japanese weapons, his unit created dozens of improvised noise-making devices that mimicked the sound of equipment malfunctions, jamming rifles, misfiring machine guns, and failing grenade detonators. "We placed these devices near the cave entrances," Running Horse wrote. "When the Japanese soldiers would attempt to fire upon Marine positions, our devices created the impression that their weapons were failing catastrophically. After all they had endured. The smoke, the sounds, the lack of sleep. This final psychological blow proved decisive. On the morning of the 6th day, something extraordinary happened. Japanese soldiers began emerging from the caves, many surrendering without resistance. Others fled their positions, attempting to relocate to different sections of the island where they were more vulnerable to conventional Marine forces. What Begay achieved with 12 men and no casualties, noted Colonel Clearwater, was what Marine commanders had failed to accomplish with thousands of troops and heavy casualties. He broke the Japanese resistance not through superior firepower, but through superior understanding of human psychology and environmental manipulation. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis B. Puller, the legendary Marine commander known as Chesty Puller, reportedly visited the Umurbrogel position after its fall and asked to meet the man responsible for the breakthrough. According to Forrester's journal, the meeting between Puller and Begay was brief but consequential. Chesty looked at this Navajo private who stood barely 5'8" and asked how he'd accomplished what a regiment of Marines couldn't. Forrester wrote, "Thomas simply said, 'I listened to what the mountain told me about the enemy.'" Puller laughed at first, then grew serious. "Whatever you did, son, you saved hundreds of Marine lives. I want it documented." But that documentation, if it was ever created, disappeared into classified archives until now. Following the success at Peleliu, Begay's informal unit received increased, though still unofficial, support. They were deployed to several other contested islands, always operating under the radar of conventional military documentation. Their methods evolved to incorporate local environmental factors, and their reputation among both American and Japanese forces took on an almost mythical quality. Japanese military intelligence began collecting reports about what they called the Ghost Unit, attributing supernatural powers to its members. One captured Japanese officer reportedly told his interrogators that his men believed they were being hunted by American skinwalkers, a reference to the shape-shifting witches of Navajo legend that he could only have learned from his own troops' encounters with Begay's unit. By early 1945, as the American forces pushed closer to the Japanese mainland, military leadership began taking a more serious interest in the unconventional tactics pioneered by Begay. A classified directive dated March 12, 1945, authorized the formation of what was called Special Operations Detachment Indian Country, the first official recognition of Begay's methods. This document represents a significant shift in military thinking, explains Dr. Whitehorse. After nearly 3 years of dismissing indigenous tactical knowledge, senior leadership finally recognized its value, but they did so in a way that still marginalized the Native Americans who developed these approaches. The directive placed white officers in command positions and relegated Begay to what they called a technical advisor role. Despite this institutional racism, Begay continued to refine and expand his methodologies. As planning began for the anticipated invasion of the Japanese mainland, Operation Downfall, his expertise was sought regarding how to combat the fanatical resistance expected from Japanese civilians and military alike. Documents show that he was flown to Washington for a series of closed-door meetings with military strategists in July 1945. What's fascinating about these records, notes Professor James Runningbear, is that they show Begay advocating for approaches that minimized civilian casualties while maximizing psychological impact. He understood that Japan's warrior culture could be turned against itself through carefully calibrated psychological operations. He wasn't proposing to break the Japanese spirit, but to redirect it toward surrender as an honorable choice. These meetings occurred less than a month before the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There is no record of Begay's reaction to the use of nuclear weapons, But his niece recalled that in later years he would become silent whenever the subject arose. Something would change in his eyes, she remembered, like he was seeing a different path that history could have taken. After the Japanese surrender in August 1945, Begay's unit was quietly disbanded. The members received various commendations, though significantly fewer and of lesser distinction than their contributions warranted. Most, including Begay himself, were sworn to secrecy about their activities, a secrecy that most maintained until their deaths. Thomas Begay returned to the Navajo Nation, where he worked as a tribal police officer for several years before becoming a teacher at a Bureau of Indian Affairs school. According to family members, he incorporated traditional knowledge and values into his teaching, but never directly spoke of his wartime experiences to his students. He would teach tracking, plant identification, weather reading, all the traditional skills, his niece recalled, but he never connected these lessons to warfare. It was as if he wanted the knowledge preserved, but separated from its martial applications. In 1952, however, Begay received an unexpected visitor. Recently declassified CIA documents reveal that a senior intelligence officer traveled to the Navajo Nation to recruit Begay for what was described as consulting work related to ongoing international security concerns. This officer, William Colby, would later become the director of the CIA during the Nixon and Ford administrations. The exact nature of Begay's involvement with the CIA remains heavily redacted, but financial records indicate he was paid as a consultant for a period of approximately 3 years. During this time, he made several trips to Washington, D.C., and at least 2 overseas journeys, one to South Korea during the final stages of the Korean War, and another to the Philippines, where the Hukbalahap Rebellion was ongoing. We can only speculate about Begay's role in these conflicts, says Professor Running Bear, but it's worth noting that both involved scenarios where conventional military forces struggled against guerrilla opponents who used the natural environment to their advantage. Exactly the kind of challenge that Begay's methods had proven effective against in the Pacific. By 1955, Begay's relationship with the CIA appears to have ended. According to family members, he returned from his final trip to Washington noticeably troubled. He told my father that they were using his knowledge in ways he never intended. Sarah Begay Wilson recalled. He said he had taught them to hunt, but they were using those skills to become predators. For the remainder of his life, Thomas Begay focused on education and cultural preservation within the Navajo Nation. He became an advocate for veterans' affairs, helping many former code talkers and other Native veterans navigate the complex bureaucracy of the Veterans Administration to receive their benefits. Yet he rarely spoke of his own service and never publicly disclosed the full extent of his wartime activities. The story might have ended there, with Begay's innovations lost to classified history, if not for a series of coincidences. In 2017, during the digitization of World War II-era documents, a junior archivist at the National Archives noticed unusual patterns of redaction in files related to the Pacific Theater. Certain operation reports had sections completely removed, with reference codes that didn't match standard military classifications of the period. This discovery led to a Freedom of Information Act request by the Native American Veterans Historical Association, which in turn prompted a review of the classified status of hundreds of documents. When Dr. Whitehorse began her research 3 years ago, she was initially looking for additional information about code talkers, but stumbled upon the first declassified references to Begay's tactical innovations. What we're discovering now is just the tip of the iceberg, she explains. There are still hundreds of files that remain classified, many under unusual restriction categories that suggest they may contain information relevant not just to historical operations, but to ongoing military and intelligence methodologies. This raises disturbing questions about the appropriation of indigenous knowledge. If Begay's approaches were indeed incorporated into modern special operations and intelligence tradecraft, as the evidence suggests, then Native American tactical philosophies have shaped American military and intelligence operations for decades, all while Native Americans themselves have been denied recognition for these contributions. There's a direct line from what Thomas Begay developed in the jungles of the Pacific to modern psychological operations and unconventional warfare doctrine, asserts retired Special Forces Colonel Mark Blackwolf, one of the few Native Americans to reach senior rank in the U.S. Special Operations community. The emphasis on environmental manipulation, psychological impact over kinetic effect, and the weaponization of an enemy's cultural beliefs. These are all core components of current special operations philosophy. Yet how many of today's special operators know that these concepts were pioneered by a Navajo private who was repeatedly denied promotion because of his race? The full extent of Begay's influence on modern warfare may never be known. Many records remain classified, and others were likely destroyed during the Cold War era when concerns about Soviet intelligence gathering led to the purging of sensitive operational documents. But even the fragmentary record that has emerged paints a picture of a tactical genius whose contributions have been systematically erased from official history. This isn't just about giving credit where it's due, though that's certainly important, says Dr. Whitehorse. It's about recognizing that indigenous knowledge systems have value and relevance in the modern world. The Western military tradition has long privileged direct force application and technological solutions, often at tremendous human cost. Begay offered an alternative approach that achieved objectives while minimizing casualties on both sides, an approach rooted in traditional Navajo philosophy that views harmony as the ideal state of existence. As more documents are declassified and more veterans or their families come forward with personal records and recollections, the full story of Thomas Begay and his innovations continues to develop. But one question looms over the entire narrative. Why was his story suppressed for so long? The most likely explanation is also the most uncomfortable one, suggests Professor Running Bear. Acknowledging Begay's contributions would have required acknowledging that indigenous knowledge systems had value at a time when federal policy was actively working to eradicate those very systems through boarding schools and forced assimilation. It would have undermined the narrative of Native Americans as primitive peoples in need of civilization. There is evidence to support this interpretation. In a memo dated January 1946, an unnamed Pentagon official wrote regarding the classification of certain Pacific Theater operations, "Care must be taken to ensure that methodologies derived from Aboriginal sources are properly attributed to scientific military development rather than to their original proponents. To do otherwise risks elevating primitive superstition to the level of modern tactical doctrine." This dismissive attitude toward indigenous knowledge persisted for decades, affecting not only how Begay's innovations were classified, but how they were taught to new generations of military personnel. His techniques, stripped of their cultural context and philosophical underpinnings, became part of special operations training without any acknowledgement of their origins. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about his time in Vietnam," recalls James Begay, Thomas Begay's grandnephew and a veteran of the Afghanistan conflict. He described techniques they were taught for psychological operations against the Viet Cong that sounded exactly like what we now know Uncle Thomas developed in World War II. But the instructors presented these techniques as if they were brand-new innovations developed by military psychologists. The irony is that my grandfather had learned similar approaches from his own father for hunting. They were traditional Navajo methods repackaged as modern military science. This pattern of appropriation without attribution continues to this day. Modern military and intelligence training incorporates numerous elements that can be traced back to indigenous knowledge systems, from tracking techniques to psychological operations methods to environmental adaptation strategies, yet rarely acknowledges these origins. What happened to Thomas Begay's legacy is a microcosm of what's happened to indigenous knowledge across many fields, explains Dr. Catherine White Deer of the University of Arizona's Department of Native American Studies. Traditional ecological knowledge is repackaged as new environmental science. Traditional healing practices become alternative medicine when adopted by non-native practitioners. And traditional military wisdom becomes innovative tactical doctrine when incorporated into Western military systems. The ongoing declassification of documents related to Begay's service offers an opportunity to correct this historical erasure, but challenges remain. Many records continue to be withheld on national security grounds, particularly those related to his post-war activities with the CIA. Others have been so heavily redacted that they provide only tantalizing glimpses of operations that may never be fully understood. Yet even with these limitations, the emerging picture of Thomas Begay's contributions is remarkable. From his initial improvisation in the Marshall Islands to the sophisticated psychological operations on Peleliu to his potential influence on early Cold War intelligence operations, Begay represents a legacy of indigenous innovation that has been systematically written out of American military history. The question now, says Dr. Whitehorse, is whether we're ready as a nation to fully acknowledge this legacy. Are we prepared to rewrite our understanding of military history to include the critical contributions of Native Americans, not just as code talkers or scouts, but as tactical innovators whose approaches shaped modern warfare? For the Begay family, the gradual unveiling of Thomas's service record has been both gratifying and painful. We always knew he had done important things during the war, says Sarah Begay Wilson, but to learn how significant his contributions truly were and to realize how thoroughly they were suppressed brings a mixture of pride and anger. He deserved recognition during his lifetime. In a small ceremony held last Veterans Day at the Navajo Nation capital in Window Rock, Arizona, a belated recognition was finally offered. The Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations presented the Begay family with the Silver Star that Thomas had been recommended for in 1945 but never received. The citation, newly declassified, acknowledged his innovative tactical approaches that saved countless American lives while significantly advancing the war effort. It was a start toward recognizing a debt long overdue, but much remains to be done. Military historians are now beginning the complex process of re-examining operations throughout the Pacific Theater to identify where Begay's methods may have been employed without attribution. Curriculum developers at service academies and war colleges are considering how to incorporate indigenous military thought into their teaching of tactical and strategic history. Yet perhaps the most important aspect of Thomas Begay's legacy lies not in formal military recognition, but in what his story reveals about the resilience and adaptability of indigenous knowledge systems. In the harshest conditions of modern warfare, traditional Navajo approaches to conflict, emphasizing harmony with the environment, psychological balance, and the minimum force necessary to achieve objectives, proved remarkably effective. What Thomas Begay demonstrated, concludes Professor Running Bear, was that indigenous knowledge isn't a historical relic, but a living system capable of addressing even the most complex modern challenges. The wisdom of the Navajo and other native nations isn't confined to the past. It offers vital perspectives for our present and future, if only we're willing to listen and acknowledge its value. As the sun sets over the Navajo Nation, casting long shadows across the high desert landscape where Thomas Begay once hunted as a boy, questions linger about how many other Native American innovations remain hidden in classified archives, their contributions erased from history by the same nation they served. The story of the Navajo warrior who turned enemy ammunition against itself may be just the beginning of a long overdue reckoning with America's selective memory of its own military history. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirit of Thomas Begay watches as his story finally emerges from the shadows, a testament to indigenous wisdom that refused to be forgotten, despite the best efforts of those who sought to bury it beneath layers of classification and cultural dismissal. What other secrets might still lie hidden in dusty archives and redacted files? How many other Native heroes have had their stories suppressed because their methods challenged conventional wisdom or their innovations threatened to upset carefully maintained hierarchies of knowledge? As researchers continue to dig through declassified documents and piece together fragmented histories, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The full story of America's wars cannot be told without acknowledging the crucial contributions of its indigenous peoples, contributions that went far beyond following orders to fundamentally reshaping how those wars were fought and won. For those who wish to honor the true legacy of warriors like Thomas Begay, perhaps the most appropriate tribute is not simply to acknowledge what was done, but to recognize the worldview that informed those actions, a perspective that valued harmony over domination, adaptation over force, and ultimately, life over death. In our troubled world, these may be the most valuable lessons that Thomas Begay's newly discovered legacy has to offer. As we face unprecedented global challenges that cannot be solved through brute force alone, the wisdom of the Navajo and other indigenous nations offers alternative approaches based on thousands of years of successful adaptation and survival. Just as Thomas Begay found innovative solutions by drawing on his traditional knowledge, perhaps we too might discover that ancient wisdom holds keys to our most modern problems. In the words Thomas Begay reportedly shared with Lieutenant Forrester during their final meeting, "The greatest victory is not defeating your enemy, but transforming him into someone who no longer wishes to be your enemy." This is the teaching of our elders, and it remains true even in a war fought with machines and fire. May we have the wisdom to heed these words as we move forward into an uncertain future, guided by the light of those whose stories are only now emerging from the shadows of history. And may we turn to God and Jesus Christ for guidance in honoring these forgotten heroes who served their nation with such distinction despite the prejudices they faced. The warrior path of Thomas Begay reminds us that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in finding balance with nature, with each other, and with ourselves. It is a lesson as relevant today as it was in the jungles of the Pacific more than 80 years ago, waiting to be rediscovered by those with eyes to see and ears to hear the wisdom that has always been there, carried in the memories and traditions of America's first peoples.